Welcome to New York, Quebec, and the water route to the center of the world. This is bonus episode 25, The Webs of Commerce, How Slavery Bound the Atlantic Littoral. While my podcast narrative focuses on the intertwined syncretic history of New York and Quebec, my passions extend beyond this scope to encapsulate the wider Atlantic world from 1600 to 1815. The Caribbean and Atlantic littoral is a crucial extension to my narrative. Barbados, Jamaica, and Saint-Domingue are great jumping-off points to understand the Anglo and French slave societies in the West Indies, along with their connections to mainland North America, Africa, and Europe. At one time, the entire Caribbean was Spanish-controlled for a short period, but sparsely settled in many places. The English inroads developed in the outer regions during times of Spanish commitment in Europe, over a 150-year period. The impact of Hispanic culture on these peripheral areas isn't long-lasting, and instead English, French, and Dutch became the dominant Creole-based languages in places like Jamaica, on the western third of Hispaniola, in the Lesser Antilles, on the ABC desert islands, and also on the Virgin Islands. The English and Dutch derived syncretic cultures that took hold in places like Jamaica, Barbados, Saint Martin, St. Kitts, and Curaçao have a very intertwined history with their Latin, French, Spanish, and to a lesser extent Portuguese counterparts. Barbados represents the early native and indentured servitude period, while presenting a model of transition to African slavery, while Jamaica will demonstrate how this system forced unique societal compromises and marks the end of slavery in the British Empire. The island initially eclipses Jamaica because of the latter being exposed to Spanish invasion, but Jamaica will see its potential fulfilled. Its landmass size and geography made it better suited to reproduce the Dutch-acquired plantation system developed on Barbados, but scaled up to a grand size on the island. The Maroon Wars, Tacky's Revolt, and finally Sharp's Revolt of 1831 all coalesced with the drastically changing international market for sugar to create an atmosphere in 1833 that led to relatively peaceful abolition. The labor would be replaced in many areas by Southeast Asian subjects of the British Empire, and slave owners received a scaled compensation from government funds. The English Civil War and Cromwell's determination to bolster England's Caribbean presence in Jamaica led to the need for immediate labor. His conquest of Ireland had produced a significant amount of prisoners, and most of these were initially sent to Caribbean islands like Barbados, St. Kitts, Montserrat, and Antigua, but they were soon diverted north to the Virginia tidal zones. Deemed too rebellious in concert with the rapidly growing African slave population on the Caribbean islands, the indentured servants almost toppled the Virginian colonial government in collusion with the enslaved African population near Jamestown. This is where the story is linked once again to the Atlantic littoral, and Bacon's rebellion in Virginia finds its genesis. Bacon's rebellion is instrumental in transforming colonial settlement policy toward incorporating the poor white smallholders and newly freed indentured servants. It is an intentional social engineering project to uphold an economic system trending toward chattel slavery. Race was fluid in the frontier buffer zones that incubated the rebellion. It was more about class and economics. The entire episode is juxtaposed against the Native American threat to those who balance their lives on the syncretic frontier, regardless of skin color. We see the definitions of race tightening in later years, but that's hindsight and ahistorical for the Atlantic Basin littoral during this time period. The rebellion's leaders get the stick, but the rest of its supporters receive the carrot and are brought into the fold. A slow realization crept in that these others that were so recently conquered and enslaved by war would have to be brought within the colonial project overseas. Even relying upon a population of indentured servants who signed a contract after their world was obliterated and subdued would prove to be a dangerous proposition without giving them the ability to rise in New World society. Bacon's rebellion had signaled an end to Irish and Scottish indentured servitude and the start of wide-scale importation of Africans to take their place. English Jamaica's special relationship with maroonage started early. A mere 3 years after the English had successfully conquered the island in 1655, they still faced considerable resistance from Spanish colonists, their slaves, and reinforcements from the Mexican mainland. Ensconced in the mountainous interior of the island, these Spanish holdouts still raided English settlements and plantations, while severely impacting trade routes and communication lines. The island of Tortuga, north of Haiti, happened to contain bands of pirates that survived by raiding Spanish shipping, and lived in a gray zone at the edge of imperial ambitions. These hardy bands of syncretic warriors were adept at carefully planned lightning raids and possessed the skills needed to track down and surprise the Spanish holdouts in the mountains. Starting in 1657, the buccaneers captured most of the Spanish rebel leadership and forced the rest to flee. But a significant population of formerly enslaved Africans were left in the mountains. These cimarrones, or wild people, would become known by the anglicized term maroon, and continue to fight for more than 75 years against the planter military garrison community of English Jamaica. These free African communities would outlast the pirates, who stayed on for several prosperous decades, headquartered at Port Royal. The 1692 earthquake would signal the end to their previous amicable relationship with the island, as the island's leadership and military command could no longer properly channel their energies or restrain them in peacetime. The Maroons' skillful guerrilla combat and their dense, naturally fortified hidden villages had forced Jamaican authorities to grudgingly acknowledge their freedoms, in exchange for their cooperation with the slave regime. They would now have to employ their considerable survival skills toward tracking down and returning any escaped slaves, but their communities were free to grow. Free blacks, Hispanics, and Jews made up 1/3 of Spanish Town's population by the start of the 18th century. The Jewish residents were mostly descendants of those who had fled the Inquisition and sought out Spanish-controlled Jamaica as an out-of-the-way place to start anew. Each of these groups were offered membership in the island's militia. From 1700 to 1760, more than 400,000 African slaves were imported through Kingston, Jamaica. On average during this time period, one could find 100,000 souls toiling on the plantations and manning the industry needed to produce products like rum on any given day. An interesting peek into the syncretic world of the Atlantic Basin, a major lieutenant in the 1760 slave revolt on Jamaica used to frequent the British slaving factory at Cape Coast Castle. He came to sell slaves and became acquainted with the agent in charge of the slaving enterprise, but was eventually captured and sold into slavery himself. When this warrior chief arrived in Jamaica, he soon realized his old friend owned a plantation nearby. The British agent hosted his old business partner with honorific dinners until he passed away. Another fascinating tidbit that links Tacky's revolt back to African conflicts is the fact that the leader is an Akan war chief who boasts of selling his defeated opponents into slavery until this happens to him. It's also intertwined with the early Maroon Wars and the concept of this autonomous free black community, whose agreement with the state is predicated on their participation in returning runaway slaves. It presents complex and nuanced angles that must be pursued through a variety of lenses. Historian Vincent Brown proposes an interesting lens through which to interpret slave revolts, as an extension or continuation of an African-based conflict. In terms of the major revolts up until 1789, all were led by former aristocrats and warriors well versed in the brutal wars of enslavement that raged across the continent. It refocuses one upon true breadth of the Atlantic Basin and links the African wars directly into the New World dynamic. Though limited in scope compared to the large-scale conflagrations consuming Africa, Caribbean slave revolts should be viewed as a form of warfare. Brown argues that even if we find this a difficult leap to make, the opposing parties certainly viewed their conflict through a military framework. The Royal Navy's Jamaican station was staffed by many enslaved Akan Africans by the start of the 18th century. This group made up almost 1/3 of the entire manpower pool of the local fleet. Historian Vincent Brown writes, "Black people performed much of this basic labor on the station. A report of 1748 listed 53 caulkers, 2 sawyers, 6 smiths, and 51 laborers, all paid 5 shillings a day. Alongside these were 14 more black laborers and 7 boat crewmen earning less than 2 shillings a day, as well as 10 King's Negroes, slaves owned by the Navy. The issue was that when the fleet returned home on rotation, enslaved Africans were left in the Caribbean. Those in bondage found themselves usually working some sort of overseer role on a plantation. They might be higher up the social ladder, but they were still enslaved. This caused many who served Britain to harbor deeply held feelings of betrayal. West Indies planters of either side during the 7 Years' War didn't truly want to conquer and incorporate neighboring sugar islands. This would depress prices. The real objective was to trash plantation infrastructure, destroy military defenses, and seize the island's enslaved population. This bounty of human chattel would then be removed to the opposing side's islands and help alleviate the interruptions in the overall transatlantic trade. This attitude helps explain the head-spinning amount of changes through the Napoleonic era. If you could hand back your enemy a destroyed and bankrupt land, you've now passed that financial problem and a restive population along. Historian Vincent Browne offers an interesting theory on how British conquests of the French Antilles played into this propensity for seizing and removing the conquered enslaved population. French militia on Martinique and Guadeloupe employed many slaves trained in the art of war and promised their freedom if they participated in the struggle against the British. During the 1759 invasion of Guadeloupe, French royal units retreated to the mountains and relied on their trained slaves to hold important geographic passes. British soldiers suffered terribly from vicious insurgent activity for a month. This included white women slaveholders leading their African militia into battle as well. These African enslaved militiamen were captured, and many ended up sold into slavery, even though they had supposedly secured their freedom by fighting for the French. These re-enslaved had both cultural and personal grievances they would bring to their new homeland. Being trained in guerrilla warfare and boiling over with hatred for the British, many of the captives would find their way to Jamaica. On the islands, much of the planter class became absentee landowners by the start of the 1700s. Earlier on, the planter class tended to be anyone who was lucky enough to survive a few years on the island and get out, but large-scale capital outlays began to be required. The volatile economic market of commodity crops also saw many estates being lost to bankruptcy or consolidated under a dwindling number of large planters. Jennifer Palmer's book, Intimate Bonds, anchors the two sides of the Atlantic Basin together by weaving a story of Saint-Domingue and my own familial city of La Rochelle. While I've studied the city's connections with Nouvelle France, and as the gateway for my own ancestors' departure, I wasn't aware of its unique legal status as applied to slavery. After seizure by forces under the command of Cardinal Richelieu, La Rochelle was put under the jurisdiction of the Parlement of Paris. In an attempt to deny the existence of enslaved peoples within the Kingdom of France, the Parlement refused to register the first series of laws restraining slavery. These series of attempts to regulate and banish the practice in the first half of the 18th century happened to coincide with the rise of Saint-Domingue. The connection between La Rochelle and Saint-Domingue was born. Here was a place where slave owners could bring their chattel and not have to worry about interference from the French crown. The port became the entrepot of not humans, but the goods produced by them, driven in a large part by the help of the Huguenot diaspora in the French Antilles. This gray legal zone between property and human begins to widen for those enslaved after the end of the 7 Years' War. The French king's free soil guardian role had given way to the concept of personal property in the form of human chattel by the start of the 18th century. The Code Noir classified slaves as movables, or movable property. This classification gave the French royal crown a way out of a tricky situation. Property exchange of this sort was not under royal purview. While slavery was sanctioned in the Antilles, slave owners were just passing through French shores with their property. This could not be interfered with. The Edict of 1716 set requirements that slave owners must seek permission from the French Admiralty before departure and complete registration of their human chattel upon arrival in the metropole. Royal authorities only allowed slaves permission to enter mainland France if seeking a Catholic education, learning a trade, or serving their master as a domestic for a year or less. Absentee ownership had now become the norm as the early generations retired back to the metropole and spread their wealth through familial connections. Agents were assigned to oversee a plantation's functions, and this was usually sublet to a white overseer. The trusted African commandeurs and personal livery of the original generation of planters assumed the role of informant through letter, constantly outmaneuvering the local agents and their white managers. By the 1770s, even this closely linked slave hierarchy was disappearing. Now the agent and their managers began to take the upper hand. The third generation of absentee owners cared little. As long as the lever flowed into their accounts, the non-existent personal investment threw open the door to unmitigated horrors. The Code Noir was finally amended in 1784, and it was aimed at reeling in the abusive attitudes and illegal use of absentee ownership property by white managers. The overhaul even provided concrete judicial avenues and clear penalties, including removal for any manager found guilty. Planters located on the island teamed up with other agents and lawyers of the absentee planters' interest. The reforms were halted and then diluted. Probably the last chance to head off the revolt had been lost to the greed of the absentee land-owning bureaucrats. I keep looking for that one wow factor to explain how the 1760 Jamaican slave revolt failed and why the 1789 Haitian revolt on Saint-Domingue succeeded. Instead, I think a bunch of subtle differences stack up and outside environmental influences play a huge role. Imagine Tacky's revolt occurs in the midst of the British Civil War, having exhausted the treasury. I'm not spotting the great differences in the cruelty levels of plantation overseers and drivers or racial hierarchies that develop. A point for further study is the concept of Jamaica's militarized garrison structure and the Royal Navy's permanent presence, and whether a similar militarized society could have made a difference on Saint-Domingue. This is where disease exposure and immunity come into play. The decimation of foreign French forces by mosquito-borne illness occurs every time a new shipment of men and material arrive from Europe. Dutch slavery varied drastically depending on the geographic location. This isn't to be confused with the actual daily state of being held in bondage. The Hudson Valley was quite different from northern Brazil, Barbados, or Curaçao. Each specific area lended itself to a particular type of economic production, climate, and both competing indigenous and European players. Experience in one particular environment could color one's views on slavery upon entering another. Both WIC employees and the various global refugees that populated Dutch New World possessions also brought experiences from Africa and even Asia to the table. The industrial-sized sugar production of northern Brazil and the isolation of the wild coast plantations produced harsh outcomes in the tropical, disease-ridden environment, but hardened racial attitudes developed in a small white Dutch population under siege by their enslaved. The loss of northern Brazil brought these hardened racial attitudes to the slaving entrepot of Curaçao. These contacts would greatly influence the Dutch merchant class of a transitioning New York. Conditional freedom grants, right to petition and wages, and even land grants were clawed back in the first 2 decades of English rule. This was directly supported by the newly minted Dutch landed gentry, whose unique mercantile contacts from their old ties to the Dutch overseas empire helped them nicely skirt the parameters of the Navigation Acts. Curaçao produced half of the total value of all Dutch Atlantic holdings from 1675 to 1750. Much of this is linked to the island's enormous role in the transatlantic slave trade. The second half of the 17th century would see the Dutch grab the largest percentage of the slave transportation market in their history, at more than 20% of the total. From 1651 to 1700, the Dutch transported 156,800 souls into bondage. Half of this total was routed through Curaçao. The last 15 years of the 17th century would see Curaçao as the destination for a full 60% of all Dutch Atlantic slave imports. The vast majority of these slaves would be re-exported to the mainland. The trade in enslaved human beings fed and in turn was fed by commerce in non-human commodities, stated historian Linda Rupert. The commodity causing demand for slaves in the Spanish mainland at the end of the 17th century to skyrocket isn't sugar but instead chocolate. The cacao bean started to be cultivated on large plantations and was quickly taking hold in public houses across Europe. To combat illicit trade on the Spanish mainland, royal decrees were issued which ordered all slave owners to present their receipts of lawful purchase through the asiento system. Any owner who could not produce such paperwork would face large fines and the forfeiture of their slaves. These would be automatically freed. After the Genoese merchant houses of Domingo Grillo and Ambrosio Lomellino received the asiento in 1662, they pursued procurement of slaves through Dutch and English middlemen, setting up a full agency on the island itself. The next holder was a Portuguese man by the name of Antonio Garcia, and he opted to exclusively tap Curaçao's bustling slave reimportation network. He employed the Dutch Koyman brothers to act as middlemen with the WIC. These same brothers would act as representatives for the next Italian banking house, and finally when Garcia once again won the contract at the start of the 1690s. The Koyman brothers ensured that the asiento served to further WIC interests until the start of the 18th century. Curaçao's relationship with Catholicism dates back to its Spanish founding. The local indigenous population was partially converted already by the time of Dutch takeover, as the island had been linked to mainland bishoprics. While officially forbidding open evangelical Catholic missions, the Dutch never made a serious effort to convert the island's population to Calvinism. Individual priests traveled to the island incognito and with portable altars, all citing open permission from the mainland Catholic authorities concerning itinerant preachers. The addition of large-scale slave importation from Africa further increased the Catholic population. When the island was added to the purview of the Bishop of Caracas, he ordered a mission to the island in 1677, the first official mission since the Dutch takeover. By 1750, almost all of the island's indigenous and African population was Catholic. The island contained no permanent structure dedicated to the church until the 18th century, but the Asiento required the Dutch subcontractors to hire 10 priests to accompany slave voyages and 2 brothers that were allowed to roam free amongst the slave population. New Netherland was a rising destination for the enslaved re-imported through Curaçao, with almost 300 individuals traded between the island and future New York City between 1659 to 1661. The slave trade would have exploded between the two locations had the British not seized it. Let's look at a local link between New Netherland and Curaçao concerning the slave trade. Peter Stuyvesant sent 11 recalcitrant Esopus natives to be enslaved on the island of Curaçao after the defeat of the tribe in the spring of 1660. This grisly aside is yet another example of the connection between the southern island and New Netherland. This sale will be a crucial factor in the development of continued fighting the next year. The document was signed on June 29, 1660, and details the enslavement of Esopus war captives and the agreed transportation to Curaçao. The following was found in an account of the transaction with the Captain Dirk Jansen, who transported the enslaved Esopus natives to Curaçao. A further interesting tidbit is the exchange of 6 Curaçao native captives north to New Netherland. The enslaved Esopus warriors would have been sent out to work on the rural plantations of the WIC. These failed at their attempts to produce commodity crops and instead focused on raising crops and livestock to feed the growing numbers of slaves housed temporarily for export to the mainland. The WIC had created housing to hold several thousand enslaved individuals to be re-imported via the island. Also mentioned is a manifest that contained 10 enslaved Africans to be sent back to New Amsterdam along with the natives from Curaçao. To 10 Negroes for the account of its owners, which the skipper has contracted to bring to the Lord Director General and Council, at 130 pieces of 8. After examining that line, I'm convinced those 10 exchanged slaves worked on WIC property in New Amsterdam. It is also within this series correspondence that we find the sad story of young Christianized African slaves that were mistakenly sold south to Curaçao and on to South America. The Vice Governor General of the WIC, located on Curaçao, wrote back about the affair, "Among other things, I have noticed in your Honor's welcomed letter the mistake that has been committed here in the trading of your Honor's slaves, especially the small children, since they had been presented for baptism with good intentions by Mrs. Stuyvesant, your Honor's beloved. If I had had the slightest knowledge of this, it would not have happened, as I believe there also completely, so that I am sorry a great error has been committed, which I fear is irreparable, because it happened so long ago that one will hardly be able to find out where they finally ended up. However, I shall make inquiries with the first ship that leaves here for Cartagena and Portobello, and if possible, try to get them back, even if I have to give 2 full-grown slaves and more for them." Let's examine the harrowing account of the Dutch slave ship St. Jan, as it made a voyage from Elmina to Real Rio Real on the west coast of Africa in 1659. They were able to purchase 385 enslaved persons in the middle of March, but spent a month and a half in search of provisions. By May, the Dutch sailors started to die, and the slaves aboard developed dysentery. Starving at the start of June, the cooper died, and barrels could no longer be repaired to hold any nourishment. The situation was so desperate that 195 slaves were sent back to Elmina as the ship searched for supplies and manpower. Starting in July, the ship's surgeon died of dysentery, but August saw the vessel finally discovering fresh supplies in Cabo de Lu Consalvo. This allowed them to voyage across the Atlantic for Curaçao. By the 3rd week of September, they were running out of water and had to make an emergency stop at Tobago, and then made their way northwest toward Curaçao. Their new cooper was poorly trained, and his barrels had leaked all their remaining water. Sailing past Los Roques in November near Bonaire, the ship was wrecked on a reef, and the slaves abandoned by the crew. When some company sloops were sent out to retrieve the slaves several days later, they were ambushed by pirates, who took 84 slaves and one WIC company ship. Out of the original 385 slaves taken from the west coast of Africa, only 106 made it to Curaçao. I just read a wonderful article in Journal de Halve Maine by Julie van den Hout, and it expanded my knowledge on the St. John slaving disaster. Much of the expanded knowledge came from the records at Elmina on the West African coast and concerned the desperate attempts to soften the loss of northern Brazil and establish a new slaving route via Curaçao. This entrepot was envisioned as a backdoor into the Spanish asiento market. It was from the West African Dutch side that this scheme faltered by hastily rearranging coastal shipping for transatlantic slave voyages. The St. Jan sadly fell victim to this haphazard attempt to restart Dutch slave trading, and its human cargo paid the ultimate price, as the ill-led ship wandered the African coast for supplies for up to 5 months. Its leadership was replaced or died, and its trade goods offloaded in a haste to fill WIC coffers, leaving the crew with little to bargain for foodstuffs. After being wrecked on the reef in Los Roques, due to a captain with almost no transatlantic navigational experience, the pirates that attacked both the Dutch relief vessels and the stranded slave ship were from Jamaica. It's most likely the pirates who rescued the surviving enslaved, then resold them on the island, possessing an English letter of marque. Peter Stuyvesant's son was sent south to Curaçao, as the colony of New Netherland was being lost to the English. In this letter, written from the island on April 16, 1665, the transformation of Curaçao was underway toward becoming a slave entrepot. With most of the natural resources harvested and the drought cycles limiting provisional gardens to feed company slaves, WIC country plantations were sold to slave traders. The company concentrated on re-exporting slaves en masse and stopped trying to develop a cash crop economy. As this letter illustrates, Mr. Balthazar Stuyvesant, your Honor's esteemed son, to whom I hope to have much occasion to be of service, is, praise God, presently with us in good health, as your Honor shall be able to learn from his letter. The inopportune takeover of New Nederland by the English is his deepest concern. Otherwise I can plainly see, as it is only natural, that he prefers New Nederland to Curaçao, because the diversion of New Nederland cannot be found here, and he enumerates for us the qualities there to such an extent that we also let our thoughts and desires go there for a change and good restoration, so that whenever it pleases God Almighty to do so, we would be very much inclined to spend our old age in such a well-blessed land with our family. We have had a bad season here this year, so that we barely harvested enough produce from the plantations in order to be able to sustain the Negroes who worked on them. Only the sugar cane is progressing nicely. For this reason I am busy setting up a small sugar mill in order to see what it will produce. If a profit can be realized from it, then we shall do our best to look for a good opportunity and a suitable piece of land for your Honor's son, Mr. Balthazar Stuyvesant, just as I have done already at St. Joris, which was previously a company's garden. If nothing better or more suitable is found there too, we shall make a trial of it there next season, God willing and with your Honor's advice and approval, and we shall require 8 to 10 good slaves for it, which the company allows the inhabitants here because they have to be used for agriculture, at 107.5 pieces of 8, which your Honor's son, Mr. Balthazar Stuyvesant, shall almost be able to realize with the monthly salary credited to his account, which he has shown me. Therefore I shall write to the company on his behalf, and hope to receive a response soon thereto. A 1659 letter from Curaçao to New Amsterdam illustrates just how connected both locations were to the illicit trade with the Spanish mainland. It grieves me that I am embarrassed by not being able to supply provisions, necessary equipment, and other repair materials for the Spanish ships that come into our harbor now and then. For this reason I submitted a proposal some time ago to our honorable Lords Superiors in the fatherland to erect here, among other things, a dry dock provided with all kinds of necessary materials and equipment in order to be able to accommodate all such ships with everything, which would serve as a great incentive and inducement to come to our harbor with their ships, and thereby increase our trade. I also proposed that it was necessary to provide these places from now on with stronger garrisons than before, as preservation and protection from all foreign designs, which the company would want to seek to hinder or discourage in this trade, which has begun so promisingly, and for the increased encouragement of those who come to trade here under their wing, and other accidents which must be expected in times of peace as well as war, so that these places may garner more esteem and respect than they have until now. Pablo Miguel Sierra Silva's research illuminated some interesting cooperation between Dutch slave traders on Curaçao and the Mexican port of Veracruz. After devastating privateering raids on the coast in the 1680s, the port city was stripped of the vast majority of its enslaved workers. Local Spanish officials fronted illegal trade for those owning the asiento with the Dutch slave traders. Rerouting some slaves through places like Puerto Rico and the Yucatan, the region gradually built up its slave population once again. In return, the Dutch traders were given valuable exports like indigo, thousands of pounds of insects to use in the cloth-making process, and access to Spanish silver bullion. Spanish officials eventually got wind of the experiment and crushed it after a little under a decade of clandestine cooperation between the two hated enemies. The asiento was placed in the hands of trusted others, and the local officials were jailed until death. Life in the littoral islands of the Caribbean was wild in the middle of the 17th century. In 1654, the WIC Council on Curaçao is casually describing how they haven't heard anything from the small garrison on Bonaire in more than half a year, as bad storms had broken the salt flats and severed communications. The soldiers on Aruba haven't been heard from in 17 months. The last time they contacted Curaçao was back in early 1652, when the garrison commander on Bonaire had employed natives to round up 900 horses for sale to New Netherland, but had faced invasion and loss of its resources. They go on to trash Stuyvesant and lambast his inability to send new naval ships south. The council ends up buying captured Portuguese prizes from passing privateers and fitting them out on Curaçao. Bonaire salt sold in New Amsterdam for 8 guilders a skipple, or 3/4 of a bushel. This skipple or sheppel measurement system was used in the Hudson Valley in business logbooks, and court fines were even payable in wheat measured via this method through the start of the 18th century. 1 guilder was equal to 6 shepels, so you would need 12 shepels to equal one of my lion dollars. I know this because on April 2nd, 1654, the WIC Council at Curaçao receives the request from Stuyvesant, but still can't help but to consider his call for aid as an economic opportunity for the company. However, just after we had bought the yacht, the ship de Goede Hoop came over from New Netherland, by which the Lord Stuyvesant so earnestly requested salt from us that we could not disregard sending the yacht with about 10 lassen of salt, which departed the 24th of October. The lassen refers to volume and would equal 120 cubic ft of hold space on a ship. We had hoped that it would be returned to us before winter. However, we have still heard nothing. If it has arrived there with the salt, it shall have realized what it has cost. We understand that salt can be sold there for almost 8 guilders a skipple. A 1643 letter from Curaçao concerns Buenairo, an interesting etymological insight into the eventual Bonaire. The orders call for military protection to be sent to the neighboring small island to protect the lucrative salt flats from native and Spanish interference. A ship containing horsemen and foot soldiers was ordered to protect the more than 40 WIC company slaves, engaged in the grueling task of mining the salt. The issue is that the whole enterprise is grinding to a halt due to starvation, and soldiers are ordered to the nearby Los Roques to hunt for sea turtles. A governor would be assigned to oversee the overall security and economic operation. Los Roques Islands are now part of Venezuela, but claimed all the way through the mid-19th century by the Dutch. This is due to the archipelago's proximity to Bonaire. The Dutch considered the islands to be attached to the government seated in Curaçao. Originally called Rocas by the Dutch, the islands were used as salt pans, turtle hunting grounds, and eventually mined for bird guano. A 1644 resolution signed by Stuyvesant on Curaçao, it details the movement of soldiers from northern Brazil onwards to New Netherland. These soldiers would arrive and help end the Second Esopus War, raging in the Hudson Valley. It also includes some details concerning the fragile nature of the island's carrying capacity and the priority of profit over security. The WIC will soon face mounting criticism for its lack of military fortitude in the face of Portuguese aggression, so these soldiers should have been a welcome sight on the island. The issue was their presence was competing with the ability to feed the enslaved, and coinciding with the harsh drought cycle, it was better to send them north. The following is a permission request from former WIC employees to seek plantations of their own on Curaçao in 1643. The WIC Council saw fit to allow them to start up plantations to produce specific crops and livestock directly to supplement the company's slave trade enterprise. Goods had to be sold directly to the company, and for set prices, enough foodstuffs must be guaranteed to be grown, so self-sufficiency is established. Anything produced by these former employees must also be sent on WIC ships only. They are required to turn out for the defense of the island, but are exempt from taxes during the period of this military service. The company will lease them farming implements, and they cannot hire any company employees or enslaved. Native and African enslaved workers were so crucial to the WIC operations on Curaçao, the governing council instituted the death penalty for anyone caught stealing from their personal gardens in January of 1643. The country WIC plantations of Curaçao ceased attempts at producing cash crops and switched over to livestock or produce by the middle of the 17th century. The enslaved workers' gardens were on WIC property, so the council took double offensive at the intrusion and interruption of their economic output. Around 15% of people in most enslaved shipments were deemed ineligible for re-export to the Spanish mainland. Most were either sick, young, or infirm. It would be this group that would raise the food necessary to feed up to 6,000 slaves held in secured warehouses on the island. Sometimes those temporarily sick or injured were sent to these country estates to recover, while still contributing to the WIC's overall output. By 1795, the slave revolt on Saint Domingue had led to a direct slave rising on the island of Curaçao. Citing the fact that the Netherlands was under French control at the time, a slave named Tula led 50 fellow enslaved in a protest to their master on Knip Plantation. Tula informed the white man that the group was no longer his property. The planter urged them to petition the governor. Instead, Tula led his small party from plantation to plantation as the countryside cleared out of white planters. His small band was joined by others from across the island, led by French slaver Louis Mercier. The three demands of Tula were an end to collective punishment, an end to labor on Sunday, and the freedom to buy clothes and goods from others than their own masters. While white planters regrouped and formed a militia, the slaves opened up the jails and communicated with leaders of the revolt on Saint-Domingue. They quickly adopted French revolutionary phrases and marching songs. A low-level guerrilla campaign was launched throughout the countryside, but Tula and other leaders were soon betrayed to a colonial mounted militia now numbering more than 60 horsemen. Tortured and then executed, these rebel leaders would be remembered by future generations on the island as freedom fighters. At its height, more than 1,000 rebel slaves swelled the assorted rebel bands, but harsh climate and military force of the Dutch could not be overcome. I wanted to highlight two further revolts during the 18th century in the Caribbean Basin and their links to recently enslaved war captives. Cato's slave rebellion that engulfed South Carolina in 1739 was partly caused by the suppression of Catholicism amongst the newly arrived evangelized African POWs from Angola. The rebellion date coincides with the Feast of the Virgin Mary, and the slaves hoped to fight their way to the Spanish in Florida in order to receive their freedom in exchange for militia service at St. Augustine. The Danish Virgin Islands contained significant populations of Dutch merchants by the end of the 17th century. More than half the population of St. Thomas was Dutch by 1691. They transformed Charlotte Amalie into a regional miniature version of Curaçao's Freeport status. The Dutch Leeward Islands were finally put under WIC oversight in 1683, but these lands experienced constant shifting sovereignty. They were also controlled by independent local merchant families who operated outside of WIC networks. By the start of the 18th century, Statia had the largest population at over 1,200, with almost 60% of this being African slaves. Saba had little more than 600 inhabitants, and Sint Maarten had no more than 500. For anyone lucky enough to visit the U.S. Virgin Islands, most are overwhelmed by the unparalleled natural beauty and stunning syncretic culture, but many bypass the smallest of 3 U.S.-controlled islands. St. John was Danish for most of its history, importing slaves directly from their station outside of modern Accra. In 1733, a large slave revolt convulsed the island for almost half the year, until Danish authorities allowed French soldiers from Martinique to help put down the revolt. The uprising was again led by Akan warriors and is seen as prequel to Tacky's revolt. It's clear that not only goods and peoples flowed around the Atlantic Basin, but also history and legends that inspired and intermingled to form parallel narratives. Denmark would finally free its slave population in 1848. Emancipation arrives in the British Islands in 1833, the French Islands in 1848, and on the Dutch Islands in 1863. For almost 200 years in the New World, The system of labor was staffed by religious enemies of the early modern European states. This is also linked to a lesser extent to the nationalism that was emerging tied to religious affiliation. Whether it was native enslavement by the Spanish until large-scale conversions occurred, or the expulsion of the Jews, the French vis-à-vis the Huguenots, or the early English attitudes toward the indentured servitude of the Irish and Scottish. The otherness is first experimented with and implemented by these states through a religious lens. It then morphs toward a more static racial boundary by the start of the 18th century. This is highly correlated to the vicious religious wars born out of the Reformation and the need to compete with opposing powers in the New World by sending groups of colonists to lay claim. This societal divide then becomes exacerbated as religious motivations merge with those of the nation-state and are supported by the profits of African slavery on both sides of the Atlantic Basin. Thanks for listening to New York, Quebec, and the water route to the center of the world. Remember to follow the show and leave me a review.